not Danish. I am Swedish by birth, and I took the plunge and moved to Denmark around 1995 the first time, and then I came back around 19 years ago, approximately. And my background is not in education whatsoever. I am one of those people that no teacher wanted at school, nor was I particularly interested in spending any time at school whatsoever. My main focus was to get out of education. And but then the life takes turns, and then suddenly you are back, and then you find some reasons to stay. And in my particular case, that was the connection with the Kaospilots. That's really what I found, that this is a good place for me. This is a place where I can thrive. In comparison with many others that do not necessarily do well at school, I actually did well. The problem was not cognitive, it was simply motivational. I couldn't really see any point in spending time in education whatsoever. And when I speak to my children today, I think I have to conclude that DNA means something. And that's sort of the basic learning I've had from all my kids. DNA means something. And what they have inherited is that lack of understanding of authority, discipline, and spending time in education. But I tell them that their life does not stop. Something happens afterwards, and eventually you will find the joy in it when you, as someone said here earlier, maybe don't lose out on curiosity, then perhaps the other things follow. Apart from running the Kaospilot, today I do have a few other things in academia, so I have something to compare with. I have 3 professorships, one in Brazil, one in Sweden, and one in Spain, and they span from art and to more an art university in Stockholm to more of a business school and finance school in Sao Paulo. So I have a few different things to compare with, and also in terms of educational platforms, philosophies, and approaches, and so forth. My main background was more in the startup community, which is a bit fitting to here. And I have worked a lot with strategy and organizational development before I joined Kaospilot. So I come from more the applied side of education more than anything, but when you spend enough time in working with education, you also pick up a few things along the way. So I'm opinionated about education, and I do think that I have some experiences on the topic. And just to frame a bit, I will answer some of these questions, I hope all of them somewhat, throughout the presentation around Kaospilot. But there are a few interesting topics I wanted to start to share, because the whole thing about the purpose of education is something that I think many of us have struggled with, particularly as times change. And the other question around why does it take so long time to change in education? I mentioned to Aurimas the other day that I have friends that after school became teachers in a variety of different levels. And most of them, they are fed up with being teachers. I think everyone beside my sister, basically. And one main reason is all the reforms that education systems undergo. Because it follows the same structure in many of the Scandinavian countries. You have a new government that come in, and one of the propositions is to improve education. The first thing you do is that you put down a commission that wants to evaluate the current system. Then when that is done, you propose a new way onwards, and you start to implement, and then there is election and the new government comes on board. And then it starts all over again. So part of it, I think, in education is that we don't necessarily give it the sufficient time. In fairness to education, there is no other institution, maybe apart from church, that have survived so long time. And that tells you something about the robustness of the model, right? You have the church, 2,000 years, pretty solid value proposition, all things considered. Now you have the education. In reality, if you look back at the earliest universities, there are of course differences, but many things have stayed the same. Well, we don't have dungeons and prisons in the universities anymore, but we used to have that. If you go back to the medieval, they had their own prisons. You could argue, though, that that has not changed at all. That's basically the purpose of education. I met once a Norwegian educational philosopher that had struggled with the question of the purpose of education throughout his life. And he said, eventually, I've landed on the idea that the purpose of education is to keep the children locked up so that the parents can contribute to the productivity of society. That is the main reason why we have it. I think it's a bit of it's sad, but there is probably some truth to it too. So there are a few things in all of this. I think some of the main challenges with education reform is that very often the decisions are made by people like me, and not by the users. There is a difference. That doesn't mean that when you're 12, you should know exactly everything about education, but I wonder sometimes how good we are to listen about, if we think of it from I never call my students customers. I hate that concept when it comes to education. But the idea of being of service is something slightly different. And I wonder sometimes how good we are when it comes to listen to the people that are supposed to enjoy whatever we cook up. Those are things that we carry with us, and Kaospilot can be seen to somewhat as an alternative to many of these. We, just to give you a broad, I presume no one here has ever visited the Kaospilots, right? Have you ever heard of it before you received the invitation? Somewhat. What have you heard? Maybe I should ask you then first.
I actually was considering doing a degree there, but then decided for Hyper Island because that was cheaper.
How can that possibly be?
Sorry.
Yes, I will hold that against you. No. Yeah.
My starting point was to come to Kaospilot.
Have any one of you heard of Hyper Island? It's a good school in Sweden. I met once the founders of the school. They were very good, and particularly they were very timely when it comes to digital products, and they were really nailed to come on the forefront of that understanding. And at one point I met one of the founders of this one, and he said, do you know, he says, that I've hired many of your alumni? And I say, yes, you're actually our biggest employer of alumni. And he said, yes, and this is part of our understanding of how to become successful. He said, I hire your people for the pedagogical platform, but then I don't let anyone near the business model. And that perhaps is in some sense quite truthful where we come in. And but it's a good school. I like it a lot. Kaospilot is a very small school. So when we say school today, we think of all that is Kaospilot, but we also think specifically about educational activities that stretches for more than 3 months. Because we do a lot more that I will explain to you later. And that means that in Denmark, we take in around 35 to 38 students every year. And this time, from now on, we can only accept Europeans, passport holders, unfortunately. Historically, we could take in Japanese, South Africans, etc., but we are not allowed to do so anymore. And that has to do with the Danish foreign policy of some sort. Why? Because that we are a private school, so we are not part of the national body that caters for international students. But Estonians can join. And if anyone is considering it, you have 13 days to run before the application deadline stops for you. Just so you know. We, apart from having this program, which is in many ways our flagship program and what we are primarily known for, we do a number of other things. And maybe the most prominent things we do these days are shorter courses and programs, primarily for professionals. The program that have had the most people joining is a program that we developed for educations and for teachers, and primarily tertiary level teachers. We have had around 8,000 people joining, and in an adjacent program, I've learned that we have had 10% of the principals at high school levels of Estonian joining these programs. So they have been spread far, from New Zealand to Canada, from South Africa to Norway. So a lot of people are joining those programs that are interested in education. The program is backed primarily on how we think education, and that's why I bring it up. And it stemmed from the idea that we received so many visitors from ministries, from municipalities, higher education, and so forth throughout all of the 90s. Up until 2008, we had maybe 1 to 2 educations per month in general coming to visit us. And when you gather all of the questions that they came with, they often landed in questions like, how do we create an engaging student body? How do we make people, how do we activate people? How do we learn to think differently about how to create a good school environment? So we cooked that all together into a program that help teachers to develop curriculum differently. But we do a ton of different things. And we are funded by the Danish government. So even if you're a private school, we are an NGO. We are an association, so we are a bit like a football club in a way. There are a number of members that elect our board that basically hire and fire me. As a fund, we are structurally different from many other educations. We are actually the only, as far as I know, surviving education in Denmark where students have to pay to go in. It's not our decision, it's a governmental decision that you have to pay to join. On the other hand, you get extra stipends, you get grants. That sort of covers the large majority of those money. So in Denmark, all education, I presume like here, they are free, or the majority of the cost will be free. But we are the only one that receives state funding and where students pay. And you could argue, how can it be that we are the only one? Well, political reasons. And no one wants to rock the boat anymore because we have been so politically an inflamed story about we as an institution. We have been taken off the state budget 3 times and come back 3 times. So it depends a bit on who has been in political power. Now things are more stable, the last 10-ish years perhaps. But the great part of being under threat consistently is that it forces innovation. You have to think differently and you have to change or else you become obsolete. So that's maybe what has maintained that we have stayed hopefully relevant and unique up until now. We, as a school, we came about early in the 1990s. We started in 1991, and there are a number of factual things, I suppose, not just the legislative part, that separates us from other education. That could be good to know before I share a few stories with you. One is that we don't have a faculty per se. Why, you may ask? Well, like many things that starts in a bootstrapped way, what your limitations can become your strength. And in our particular way, we didn't have money to hire a faculty because we had so few students in the first couple of years. So what do? You hire people based on hourly payment. Over time, you refine that particular system, means that you have just-in-time teaching. You bring teachers in when that is important, when it's the right moment, and so forth. And that the great part of this, that we don't have additional fat in the organization. We pay exactly for the value delivered. What are the drawbacks? Much of the core knowledge of Kaospilot is not something that I or my colleagues control. It is distributed to other people, which again then requires an ability to maintain a distributed network of faculty. So even if we have maybe just just below 20 people hired at the school today. We have maybe 60 others that delivers the education for longer periods of time or shorter periods of time. So cost-effective sort of control issues with that model. The other one, why do we take in 35 to 38? And it's quite interesting because very often when people come in, they assume that this is somewhat a magical number, rooted in deep pedagogical considerations. No, it's not. It's basically how many people that could fit the room that we were in when the school started. It's sort of functioned for 30 plus people, not more than 40. That suddenly then become the rule. And that sort of drive then every type of decision. Well, we need 35. So today we are funded by the government for bringing 35 people in. If we take in 38, we only get for 35. But we have to take in 35. There is no pedagogical reason that 35 is a particularly good number to run an education. That's just how it became. And it's interesting because in the terms of how we think of how educations change, you know the definition of an institution, right? Have you heard that before? Normally we say that an institution is a need that have evolved, it's an answer to a need that have evolved so far from the actual need so it doesn't remember why it exists. And that is sort of how we become institutionalized. There, I have a need, I can't resolve it on my own, I call you and I call you and we start to resolve this. After a certain amount of time, we need to be better, more efficient, effective, we turn it into an organization, and gradually we evolve to become an institution. And then we have forgotten all about the need that we tried to resolve in the first place. So as an institution, Kaospilot of course always needs to remember this, that there is a danger of separating yourself from your actual task. Now, are you up for some pictures? That I can show you, so maybe get a bit of a better sense of if I can get this to work. I normally say that there is a prerequisite if you ever want to work as a principal at Kaospilot. You need to have the ability to speak for hours about nothing. So I have prepared a 5-hour PowerPoint presentation, but we'll move a bit into figure out what resonates. And if there are any clarifying questions, I think the easiest is if you just interrupt me. And I will remember and see to sort of factor in the some of these questions, that some of the topics that you raised. So, how many of you have been to Aarhus? A few actually, that's impressive. So it's the second largest town in Denmark. It's on the peninsula. So it's basically north of Hamburg and you eventually end up in our town. It's around 300,000 inhabitants and it's basically a university town. The Aarhus University have in the excess of 40,000 students. The third largest education institution in Denmark, VIA, is also here with 15,000 students, but more spread out across Denmark. So I would argue somewhere around between a fifth and a sixth of the whole populations are students. So it really gives a particular vibe to the city. This is part of the old town. This is where our school used to be situated. So we are situated just to the left in here. And we were there for almost 20 years, not fully 20 years. But the facilities were so deteriorated in the end, so we had to move. When it smelled like toilet in the whole school and people were sitting in jackets because it was so cold, that should have been there by the time you were there, Aurimas.
And a constant construction around.
Constant construction around, so we had to move at one point. The biggest problem with that is that old buildings have soul. They have a culture. It basically clings in the walls, and when you move to new buildings, you have to create that. So we moved into this. This had all what you could dream of in terms of facilities, but zero soul and no culture. The question then can come up immediately, can you transfer it? or does it cling to the wall? Is it simply the viscosity between people? Is it the networks, or is it actually something that clings in the wall? And this was an interesting experience. So Kaospilot is a small school based on relationships. We have always operated on 2 floors, maybe 3. 2, I would argue. Here we ended up on 6 floors. What happens when you come in the morning? So we thought, design-wise, let's place the heart of the school, the reception, the kitchen, on the 3rd floor, in the middle. That would be a good point. Because there was an elevator, so we couldn't place it at the bottom, because then people would have skipped that part and gone directly for the elevator to disappear up. So we said maybe on the middle part, that would make the biggest chance that people would meet. Because meeting is important for curiosity, creativity, and so forth. What was the consequence when you come in the morning, and the morning looked like perhaps a bit like it did here early this morning? It rains, it snows, and you are pissed off because you have been biking for 10 kilometers to go to the school. You go in and you open the door on the 1st floor and say, good morning. You do the 2nd and you do the 3rd. Do you go up to the 6th floor to then go back to the 3rd floor? No, you don't. At least I didn't. I did it in the beginning, but then no. Which means that that type of community development stopped when you don't meet people. So we learned that a lot in here, what actually happens, because you can simply see it in front of you, how the community quickly loses out if you don't create opportunity for people to meet.